This video was brought to you by Ground News. When American and Chinese trade negotiations began on Saturday, markets weren't optimistic. Beijing had strongly signaled that it wouldn't be making any concessions until Trump wound down his tariffs. But, well, Trump loves his tariffs, and his administration sounded like they were preparing the political ground for a full-scale trade war, with Trump warning late last month that children would have to make do with 2 dolls instead of 30. However, on Monday morning, the two sides put out a joint statement outlining a dramatic reduction in tariffs for the next 90 days. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at what was agreed, and why this all suggests that we're moving towards a deal much like the Phase 1 deal that Trump negotiated back in 2020. We've just published a new issue of our official magazine, Too Long, which runs through the world's most influential people and how they wield their power. From Elon Musk's takeover to the power of melee, or whether Jerome Powell can resist Trump. Read more by clicking the link in the description. So let's start with a quick overview. In a sense, the current trade war is really just an escalation of a trade war that Trump started in his first term. Since 2018, the average US tariff on Chinese imports has been at about 20%, compared to an average of about 3% for imports from the rest of the world. Now, these tariffs were mostly focused on certain commodities, like steel, and strategically important goods, like solar panels. They were then mostly kept in place by the Biden administration, and even expanded on in certain areas. However, in his second term, Trump has taken things up a notch, sparking an unprecedented tit-for-tat trade war with China. This really began on February 1st, when Trump imposed a flat 10% tariff on all Chinese imports on top of the pre-existing tariffs. 3 days later, China retaliated with a 15% tariff on coal and liquefied natural gas imports from the US, as well as a 10% tariff on crude oil, agricultural machinery, and large displacement cars. In response, on March 3rd, Trump added another 10%. And again, China retaliated with more tariffs on certain US agricultural exports. Then, on April 2nd, otherwise known as Liberation Day, Trump slapped a further 34% tariff on all Chinese imports. 2 days later, China retaliated with a symmetrical 34% tariff. On April 7th, Trump threatened another 50%. On April 9th, China retaliated preemptively, adding another 50% itself, taking China's flat tariff rate on US imports to 84%. On April 10th, Trump upped the stakes by taking America's flat rate on all Chinese imports to 145%. And on April 11th, China went to 125%, effectively ending bilateral trade between the world's two biggest economies. Now, originally, the Trump administration seemed pretty confident about all of this. Trump claimed that China needs to make a deal with us. We don't have to make a deal with them. And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told CNBC that, quote, China are playing with a pair of twos. The basic argument here seems to be that the US runs a massive trade deficit with China, which means that Chinese businesses need access to the American market more than vice versa. Now, there's certainly some truth to this, and most economists originally expected a trade war to hurt China more than it hurt America. The Peterson Institute for International Economics estimated last year, for instance, that if both countries imposed a 60% flat tariff on each other, China's GDP would shrink by $770 billion, while America's would only shrink by $327 billion. However, that's not quite how things panned out. Beijing immediately signaled that they wouldn't be making any concessions until the tariff came down, and the Trump administration quickly toned down its bullish rhetoric. Last month, Bessent admitted that the tariffs were, quote, unsustainable, and Trump himself started pushing for lower tariffs, posting on Truth Social that 80% tariff on China seems right, up to Scott B. This rhetorical U-turn was presumably a response to the negative reaction by both the markets and the electorate. As we've detailed in previous videos, the markets really don't like Trump's tariffs at the moment, with both American stocks and the US dollar well down since Trump took office, and recent polling suggests that the electorate concurs. Trump's approval rating has fallen dramatically in recent weeks, driven largely by a steep decline in how voters think Trump is handling the economy, which used to be one of his strong suits. Anyway, this is why earlier this month, the two sides organized a meeting in Geneva, which was held over the weekend. And well, it looks like things went pretty well. According to a joint statement published on Monday morning, the US agreed to lower tariffs on Chinese imports to 30%, down from 145%, while China agreed to lower its tariff on US goods to 10%, down from 125%. Now, this reduction in tariffs will last for 90 days, during which time the US and China have agreed to try and negotiate a more substantial trade deal. Now, it's important to stress that these tariff rates are still far higher than they were before Trump's Liberation Day, and far higher than the global average. It's also worth noting that this reduction only applies to the flat 145% tariff rate, and specific things, like say the 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles introduced by Biden, would stay in place. Similarly, the agreement says nothing about the targeted export restrictions that China has imposed on certain goods, including rare earth metals. Nonetheless, it's obviously an improvement on last week, which is why both American stocks and the dollar rose on Monday. In the subsequent press conference, the Chinese negotiating team were pretty tight-lipped, but Bessent was a bit more expansive and remarkably diplomatic. He first insisted that while the US would pursue supply chain independence in certain strategic industries, neither side wants, quote, a decoupling, but rather just more balanced trade. Furthermore, Bessent said that there was no discussion about currency during the talks, despite the fact that Trump and senior members of his administration have long accused Beijing of weakening its currency in order to boost exports. This general softening of rhetoric, plus the fact that Bessent also flagged the possibility of so-called purchase agreements, which is basically when China commits to buying a certain amount of stuff from the US, all suggests that Trump has quietly given up on a wider restructuring of the global trading order, if that ever even really was his intention, and instead that we're moving towards a deal much like the so-called Phase 1 deal, agreed by China and the US back in February 2020, whereby China agreed to buy an extra $200 billion worth of stuff from the US, including specified amounts of American manufactured goods, agricultural products, and energy products. This sort of deal would be politically useful for Trump, because he'd get to say that China has agreed to buy billions of soybeans or oil or whatever, which is the sort of tangible benefit that both the American electorate and certain American exporters would appreciate, and should partially address the bilateral trade imbalance between China and the US. But it would be unlikely to really change the fundamental structure of the world economy, or achieve any of the grander ambitions touted by Trump's team, like reindustrializing America or fixing the overall trade deficit. But working all of this out is a complex and nuanced issue, and as such there's plenty more to read about it online, with 323 sources reporting on this issue alone. The problem is, how can you be sure that what you're reading isn't just hugely biased? Well, that's a problem we face when making these videos too, and luckily that's where this week's sponsor, Ground News, comes in. For this story in particular, they've identified that there are at least 53 left-leaning and 35 right-leaning sources reporting on it. In fact, in addition to this, they've also shown the main differences in the headlines between left and right-leaning outlets, with left-leaning outlets framing the US-China tariff reduction primarily as a positive step towards easing an ongoing trade war, and right-leaning coverage expressing skepticism around the deal's durability. We're able to do that because of our sponsor, Ground News, whose incredible website and app lets you discover the news and pulls back the curtain on media bias. That's because every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. But one of the best parts of the app is their blind spot feed. It presents you with stories and articles that haven't been reported on by one side of the aisle or the other, helping you better break out of your media bubble and discover what those on the other side of the political spectrum are really saying. This is all in addition to the bias distribution we mentioned earlier. And together, these fantastic features help you to figure out exactly who's behind the stories you're reading, and what agenda they might have. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape, and I think that an app like this will only become more essential as the media landscape continues to evolve. So if you're interested in everything that Ground News has to offer, you can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan by using the link in the description, or by scanning the QR code on screen. And this offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.